This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment, and it does not depict real people, real events, or official military actions. The night my sister became engaged to a SEAL captain, the room was filled with soft jazz and polite laughter, the kind that floats just above the truth. I stood near the tall windows of the Savannah ballroom, watching the river slide past like it had somewhere better to be. I was 34 years old, and I had learned how to make myself small in rooms like this. My mother squeezed my shoulder with a smile that never reached her eyes and turned to my sister's fiancé. "This is Aaron," she said our disappointment. The word landed lightly spoken like a joke, but it carried the full weight of every year I had been overlooked. People laughed the way they do when they are relieved it is not them. I felt nothing on my face because I had practiced that for years. The captain stepped forward and took my hand. His grip was firm, professional, polite. "Thank you for coming," he said, and I nodded because that was easier than explaining anything. For a moment, his eyes lingered on mine longer than courtesy required, and something in his posture changed. He stepped back, half a pace, straightened, and raised his hand in a precise salute that cut through the music like silence. Conversations died. Glasses froze mid-air, and my mother's smile faltered. No one spoke. I could hear the river again. In that instant, I knew this night would not end the way my family expected. They had built a story about me over decades, and they believed it because it made everything else simpler. I had left home at 20 with a single bag and no farewell party. 14 years later, they still could not say what I did, only that it was somewhere in the military and that I never talked about it. They were right about one thing. I never talked about it because no one ever asked. I spent my days in Norfolk in a quiet apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and seawater, answering calls that did not come with explanations and finishing work that could not be shared. The week before the engagement, an email arrived from my mother reminding me to come early and not mention work because it might make things awkward. I read it twice and closed my laptop. Awkward had always been their word for truth. Back in the ballroom, the captain lowered his hand but did not look away. His voice was calm when he spoke my name, and it was the first time that night anyone had said it without shrinking it. My sister stared between us, confused and angry. My parents looked like they were watching a script slip from their hands. I felt the room waiting for me to speak, to explain, to soften the moment for everyone else. I did not. I had learned that silence can be its own answer. Somewhere behind the music, I felt my phone vibrate with a message I would read later, and everything I had carefully kept separate began to drift closer together. If you had been standing there, would you have said something, or would you have let the story continue because it was easier that way? That salute was not the end of my humiliation. It was the beginning of a reckoning I had spent 14 years preparing for without ever knowing it. And once it started, there was no way back. I grew up learning how to disappear without leaving the room. In our house in coastal Georgia, the walls were always clean, the table always set, and my parents always ready with a polite explanation for why things were the way they were. I was not a problem child, and that somehow made it worse. I did well in school, stayed out of trouble, and learned early that praise was a limited resource best saved for someone else. That someone else was my younger sister Eliza. Eliza was bright in a way that drew attention without effort. She smiled and people leaned closer. She laughed and rooms softened. From the time she was small, my parents spoke about her future as if it were already agreed upon. Beautiful, successful, admired. When she entered a room, they noticed. When I entered, they adjusted. I became the practical one, the reliable one, the one who did not need much because I never asked for it. My mother had a way of framing everything gently so that no one could accuse her of cruelty. "Aaron is independent," she would say when teachers asked why I did not attend certain events. "Aaron does not need the spotlight," my father would add when relatives asked why my accomplishments were never mentioned. They said it with smiles and nods, and people accepted it because it sounded reasonable. Over time, I accepted it too. Eliza received new dresses for milestones. I received advice. Eliza was encouraged to try new things. I was praised for not needing them. When college acceptance letters came, my parents hosted a dinner for Eliza when she was admitted to a private school up north. When mine arrived a year later, my mother hugged me and said how proud she was that I had chosen something affordable and sensible. Sensible became my name. At family gatherings, people asked Eliza about her plans and asked me if I was still doing well. Doing well was the phrase used when there was nothing else to say. I learned to answer it with a smile and change the subject. I learned that if I stayed quiet long enough, the attention would move on. My parents never yelled at me, never insulted me directly, never did anything dramatic enough to be called abuse. Instead, they practiced a steady erosion. Every choice I made was quietly reframed as a compromise. Every success was softened so it would not cast a shadow. When Eliza struggled, my parents rallied. When I struggled, they trusted I would figure it out. They said it was because I was strong. Strength became another word for solitude. By the time I was 19, I understood my role in the family story. Eliza was the promise. I was the background. It was not malicious, it was efficient. At least that is how they justified it. The summer I turned 20, I told them I was leaving. Not moving out, not transferring schools, leaving. I had already filled out the paperwork and signed what needed to be signed. I told them over dinner with the same calm tone I had used my whole life. My father looked surprised. My mother frowned slightly as if I had broken an unspoken rule. The military, she repeated slowly as though testing the word. Why would you do that when you could do so many other things? I told her it was something I wanted, something that made sense to me. She nodded, but her eyes drifted away, already calculating how this would be explained to others. Eliza asked if it was dangerous, and my father said everything was dangerous these days. No one asked how I felt. No one asked what had led me there. When the day came, there was no send-off, no photo, no gathering. My mother hugged me quickly and reminded me to call when I arrived. My father shook my hand and told me to be smart. Eliza was not home. She had plans. I carried my bag to the car myself and drove away before anyone changed their mind or asked a question that might have anchored me. I remember glancing back at the house once before turning the corner and feeling something settle in my chest. It was not anger. It was clarity. I was leaving a place where I had never quite existed. Training stripped away the last of the assumptions I had carried with me. There was no room for being sensible or invisible. You performed or you failed, and failure was immediate and honest. I learned to listen to instructions, to trust my instincts, and to keep my emotions contained. No one cared about my family role or whether I was easy to overlook. They cared whether I could be counted on. That was enough. Years passed, and the distance between my life and my family grew wider without anyone naming it. I called on holidays, sent cards, and answered questions vaguely. "What do you do exactly?" my aunt once asked, and my mother answered for me something with logistics, I think. I let it stand. It was easier that way. When Eliza called with news of her engagement, my parents sounded relieved, as though something had finally gone according to plan. They spoke about the venue, the guest list, and her fiancé with pride. "He is impressive," my mother said more than once. When they told me when and where, I said I would be there. My mother hesitated before reminding me to keep things light. "This is her moment," she said, as if I might forget. I promised I would not draw attention to myself. It was a promise I had been keeping my entire life. Norfolk was where my real life existed, and it looked nothing like the version my family imagined. My apartment sat on the third floor of a concrete building a few blocks from the water, close enough to smell the salt when the wind shifted, but far enough to stay quiet. Inside, there was very little decoration. A couch, a small table, a lamp by the window, and shelves that held binders instead of photos. People sometimes assume minimalism is a style choice, but for me it was a habit formed by years of knowing I might not stay long anywhere. That night, I came home later than planned, my body heavy with the kind of fatigue that settles deep into the joints. The day had been long and tightly controlled, beginning before sunrise and ending with paperwork that demanded precision even when your mind wanted rest. I moved through my routine without thinking, shoes off, jacket, hung keys placed in the same dish every time. The silence in the apartment was deliberate and welcome. I made coffee even though it was late because the smell grounded me, and sat at the table reviewing notes I could not share with anyone outside a very small circle. I will not describe the work because that is not how this story is told, but I will say it required trust and accountability and the understanding that mistakes ripple outward whether anyone ever hears about them or not. When I finally closed the last folder, my phone buzzed against the table, and for a moment I considered letting it go unanswered. The screen lit up with my mother's name, and then an email preview followed before I could decide. It was short, written in the careful tone she used when she wanted to guide a situation without appearing controlling. "Don't mention work at the engagement," she wrote. "Some people wouldn't understand, and we don't want things to be awkward for Eliza." I stared at the words longer than necessary, letting the familiar mix of irritation and resignation pass through me. It was not anger exactly, more like the recognition of a pattern so old it felt inevitable. My work was always something to be managed, explained away, or kept quiet, not because it was shameful, but because it complicated the story they preferred to tell. I replied with a simple, "Okay," and closed the laptop. The truth was, I had already planned to say very little. Silence had been my default long before it became a request. Still, the message lingered because it confirmed what I already knew. They did not want the real version of me in that room. They wanted the outline, the simplified shape that fit neatly beside Eliza without drawing focus. I stood by the window and watched a cargo ship move slowly across the dark water, its lights steady and unbothered by who was watching. In this life, no one asked me to shrink. No one softened my choices or reframed my decisions to make them more palatable. If I performed well, it was noted. If I made an error, it was addressed directly. There was no room for vague praise or quiet dismissal. It was not kind, but it was honest, and I had come to value that more than approval. The next morning began like most others with a briefing that left no room for small talk. I listened, took notes, and spoke only when necessary. When the day finally released me, I returned home, changed clothes, and packed for Savannah with the efficiency that comes from doing everything alone. There were no outfits laid out by someone else, no suggestions about what would photograph well. I chose a simple dress and sensible shoes and placed them carefully in the bag. As I folded the last item, I thought about how different my worlds were and how little overlap there had ever been. My family knew I was disciplined, reliable, and distant. My colleagues knew I was steady under pressure and careful with my words. Neither group knew the full picture, and I was not sure I wanted them to. On the drive south, the radio faded in and out, and I let the silence stretch between stations. I passed familiar exits and unfamiliar towns, each mile marking the shift from the life I had built to the one I had been assigned at birth. I wondered briefly what it would feel like to arrive and be introduced without qualifiers, without jokes, without the careful lowering of expectations. The thought passed quickly because it felt unrealistic. By the time I crossed into Georgia, the sun was low and the sky had turned the pale orange that makes everything look temporary. I pulled into a rest stop and checked my phone. There were messages from my mother about arrival times and seating arrangements, and one from Eliza reminding me to come early because she wanted family photos. I typed a polite response and put the phone away. Have you ever been asked to stay quiet so others could feel bigger? The question surfaced in my mind uninvited, and I wondered how many times I had accepted that role without realizing it. As the miles rolled on, I understood that my family was not afraid of my work. They were afraid of what it represented: independence, authority, and a version of me that did not rely on their approval. They preferred the silence because it kept the hierarchy intact. By the time the lights of Savannah appeared ahead of me, I had already decided I would keep my promise. I would not talk about work. I would not correct anyone. I would not disrupt the carefully arranged narrative. But I also knew something else had changed. Silence was no longer the same as consent, and I was done pretending otherwise. Competence has a cost that no one talks about, especially when it comes quietly and without witnesses. I learned that early in training when exhaustion stripped away any idea of fairness and left only function. There were no speeches about pride or destiny, just long days that began before the sun and ended long after your body wanted to stop. You learned quickly that effort meant nothing if results did not follow, and that complaining only made you less reliable. I adapted because adapting was easier than failing, and failure carried consequences that did not need to be explained. Over time, discipline stopped feeling imposed and began to feel like structure, something solid to hold on to when everything else was uncertain. I watched others leave quietly, some because they were injured, some because they were tired of trying to measure up to standards that did not bend. When they left, there were no parades, just paperwork and a locker cleared by the end of the day. You learned to accept absence as part of the job. Loss did not always come with grief. Sometimes it came as silence where a familiar voice used to be. I carried those moments with me, but I never talked about them because there was no place to put them. At home, no one asked, and at work, you did not ask unless you were prepared for the answer. My family calls went unanswered more often than not because I did not want to speak, but because there was nothing to say that would translate. How do you explain a day that required precision and restraint without sounding distant or strange? How do you describe responsibility without appearing dramatic? So I learned to say very little and let the gap widen. There were no medals on my walls, no framed certificates or photographs in uniform. I kept my life uncluttered because reminders were unnecessary. I knew what I had done and what it had cost, and that knowledge was enough. When people talk about service, they often imagine recognition ceremonies or applause, but most of the work happens far from those moments. It happens in rooms where no one is watching and decisions must be made without reassurance. You learn to live with uncertainty and to trust your training even when it isolates you. Over the years, my sense of identity shifted away from external validation. I stopped needing to be seen to know my value. That was freeing in some ways, but it came with a quiet loneliness I did not name until much later. Holidays passed without much notice. Birthdays were marked by brief messages and polite calls. My parents asked if I was safe, and I said yes because that was easier than explaining what safety meant in my world. They never asked if I was tired or if the work followed me home. They never asked if I had lost anyone or if the responsibility ever weighed on me. I do not blame them entirely. They did not know how to ask, and I did not know how to answer. Still, there were moments when the absence of curiosity felt heavier than any physical burden. When Eliza visited, she spoke about her plans, her work, her friends, and my parents listened with interest. When it was my turn, the conversation drifted away naturally, as if my experiences were interchangeable or unremarkable. I learned to let that happen without protest. It was not worth the effort to correct a story no one wanted revised. Over time, the lack of recognition became something I expected rather than resented. I built a life that did not depend on approval, and I told myself that was strength. But strength without acknowledgement can harden into distance, and distance can turn into isolation if left unchecked. There were nights when the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than usual, and I sat alone at my table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator because it was the only sound in the room. In those moments, I wondered what it would feel like to be asked simply, "Are you okay?" without the need for reassurance or explanation. The thought passed quickly because dwelling on it did not change anything. I had chosen a path that demanded competence above all else, and competence rarely comes with comfort. As the engagement weekend approached, I felt the familiar tension between who I was and who my family believed me to be. They had known me as quiet, capable, and unremarkable for so long that anything else would disrupt the balance. I understood then that my silence had protected them from questions they did not want to face. It allowed them to maintain a version of the family where everything made sense. The cost of that silence was that no one ever learned how much it took to keep everything from falling apart. I accepted that cost because it was familiar, and familiarity can be comforting even when it is limiting. By the time I arrived in Savannah, I had already braced myself for the invisibility that awaited me. I had worn it for years, and I knew how to carry it without flinching. What I did not know was how quickly that invisibility would be challenged, or how little effort it would take for the truth to surface once it was no longer contained. The email arrived without ceremony, the way most consequential things do. I was sitting at the small table in my apartment in Norfolk, the window cracked open just enough to let in the evening air, when my phone buzzed once and went still. I did not reach for it right away because I recognized the sender line, and I knew whatever waited there would not be casual. Norfolk HQ messages never were. When I finally opened it, the subject line was "Brief Operational Review Pending." No greeting, no explanation, just a timestamp and a reference number. I read it twice, then a third time slower, letting the words settle. An operational review was not an accusation, but it was never random either. It meant someone had flagged something old enough to require context and serious enough to be reopened. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the steady hum of the building around me. My first instinct was to catalog every decision I had made in the last year, then the last 5 years, then further back than that. Training does that to you. It teaches you to inventory your actions before panic has time to take hold. I knew my record was solid. I also knew that solid records did not always protect you when interests shifted. The email did not say who had initiated the review or why, and that omission mattered. Reviews requested internally followed a predictable process. This one felt different. I logged into the secure system and pulled the reference number, tracing it back through channels that were intentionally opaque. There was nothing overt, just a notation that a prior file had been accessed recently. Not amended, not corrected, simply opened. The date stopped me. The file in question was from several years ago, a period of my career that had been quiet externally but demanding in ways that did not translate well on paper. It was the kind of work that ended with clean outcomes and no applause, and because of that, it rarely drew attention after the fact. Someone reopening it now suggested motive. I closed the system and sat still, letting the implications line up. This was not about error, it was about narrative. Reviews can be used to clarify or to contain, depending on who controls the framing. I had seen it happen to others capable people whose work became inconvenient once the political landscape shifted. The truth was still there in the data, in the logs, in the recorded decisions, but truth alone does not advocate for itself. It requires someone willing to let it stand, even when it complicates things. I thought about the engagement again, the polite smiles, the careful request to keep things light. My family wanted the story simple. This email told me the system might want the same. I forwarded the message to my secure archive and began pulling my own records, not because I was worried, but because preparedness was the only response that had ever served me well. As I worked through the files, I noticed subtle inconsistencies, not errors, but timing that suggested access without action. Someone had looked without leaving a clear reason. That alone was enough to change how I viewed the weekend ahead. The engagement was no longer just a family obligation, it was a collision point between two narratives that had been kept separate by my silence. I wondered briefly if the timing was coincidence, then dismissed the thought. Coincidences exist, but patterns announce themselves when you know where to look. I had learned that lesson the hard way. I drafted a brief acknowledgement of receipt to HQ confirming availability and requesting clarification on scope. The response came back quickly, non-committal, and procedural. Further details to follow. That was not reassuring. I closed the laptop and stood by the window again, watching the lights of the city reflect off the water. Norfolk had taught me that stability is provisional. You build it through consistency and discipline, but it can be tested without warning. I thought about how often I had relied on the idea that doing the right thing was enough. It usually was until it was not. The system, like families, prefers order, and order is maintained by stories that make sense to those in charge. If your truth disrupts that order, it becomes negotiable. That realization did not make me angry, it made me alert. I packed the rest of my bag with care, adding a folder I had not intended to bring. As I zipped it closed, I felt the subtle shift that comes when stakes change. This was no longer just about being overlooked or underestimated. This was about control over a narrative that could determine how my past would be remembered. I had spent years letting others define me because it was easier than insisting on complexity. I was no longer willing to do that. The email had not accused me of anything, but it had done something just as significant. It had reminded me that silence does not always protect you. Sometimes it only makes it easier for others to speak for you. Savannah greeted me the way it always does, with charm first and truth later. The streets near the river were lined with old trees draped in moss, and the buildings carried a kind of beauty that suggested permanence, even when everything inside was temporary. I checked into the small hotel my parents had chosen for family and stood for a moment in the lobby watching people move through the space with practiced ease. This city was designed to impress, and it did so effortlessly. By the time I arrived at the riverfront venue, the afternoon light had turned golden, and the air carried the faint scent of flowers arranged by professionals who knew exactly how much elegance was required. My parents were already there, moving through the space like hosts rather than guests. My mother looked pleased in a way she rarely did when I was involved. She embraced me quickly and stepped back to assess my appearance with a nod that suggested approval mixed with relief. "You look fine," she said, which was her version of reassurance. My father smiled and gestured toward the room where Eliza stood beside her fiancé, surrounded by friends. "There they are," my mother said proudly, as if she had personally assembled the scene. Eliza looked radiant and relaxed, the kind of ease that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. Her fiancé stood close, attentive, and confident in the way of someone accustomed to respect. Conversations paused as my parents introduced me to people whose names I would not remember. "This is Erin," my mother said, Eliza's older sister. She left out everything else, and I understood that was intentional. The omission made things simpler. Compliments flowed toward Eliza about the venue, the ring, the dress she would wear later. My parents absorbed them like proof of a job well done. When someone turned to me, the questions were brief, polite, and easily redirected. "So, what do you do again?" one woman asked, and before I could answer, my mother stepped in with a practiced smile. "She does something administrative with the military," she said, quickly changing the subject. I did not correct her. It was not worth the effort. As the afternoon wore on, my parents grew more animated, clearly energized by the attention. They spoke about Eliza's future plans and her fiancé's career, with pride layering detail upon detail. I watched from a comfortable distance, aware of how little space there was for me in their narrative. At one point, my mother pulled me aside near the edge of the terrace overlooking the river. She lowered her voice and smiled as if sharing a confidence. "Just keep things light tonight," she said. "We don't want anything to feel awkward." I nodded because that was what was expected. Awkward had always been their shorthand for anything that disrupted the image they worked so hard to maintain. I understood then that my presence was conditional. I was welcome as long as I did not complicate things. The venue filled with laughter and music and the soft clink of glasses. Everything looked perfect on the surface, and that perfection demanded protection. As I stood there listening to conversations that skimmed the surface of real connection, I felt the familiar sensation of being both present and invisible. It was easier for them if I remained that way. I wondered how many times I had accepted this arrangement without question. Why do families protect appearances more than people? The thought lingered as I moved back into the crowd. Eliza greeted me warmly but briefly already pulled in multiple directions. Her fiancé shook my hand again and thanked me for coming, his tone polite and measured. My parents watched closely as if gauging whether I would say something unexpected. I did not. I smiled, answered questions vaguely, and let the evening unfold. From the outside, it looked like harmony. Inside, I could feel the tension between what was being celebrated and what was being concealed. This was not the first time I had seen beauty used to distract from discomfort. It was simply the most obvious. As the sun dipped lower and the lights came on, I realized how much effort went into maintaining this version of the family. Every smile, every word, every omission served a purpose. They believed that if everything looked right, then it must be right. I had lived long enough to know better. Savannah was beautiful, but beneath the charm there were stories no one told aloud. Standing there watching my parents bask in the moment, I understood that they were not malicious. They were afraid. Afraid that if the truth surfaced, it would unravel the story they had spent years perfecting. I had been part of that story once, but only as a supporting detail. Tonight, I was a variable they could not fully control, and that made them uneasy. As the engagement dinner approached and the guests settled into their places, I took my seat quietly, aware that the night was still young and that appearances can only hold for so long before something shifts. The ballroom changed as night settled in, trading daylight for candlelight and the soft glow of chandeliers that reflected off polished floors. Servers moved in practiced patterns, carrying trays of wine and plates arranged with care. The guests were the kind of people who knew how to fill a room without raising their voices, executives and officers and friends of friends who shared an ease that came from familiarity with status. Music floated just loud enough to soften the edges of conversation. I took a seat near the perimeter where I could see everything without being seen. That position had always suited me. From there, I watched my parents circulate with pride, my mother's hand resting lightly on Eliza's back as she introduced her to new faces, my father nodding along as her fiancé spoke with quiet confidence. Glasses clinked and compliments flowed. The night unfolded exactly as planned. A woman beside me leaned over with a smile and asked how I knew the couple. I said she was my sister, and she nodded warmly before turning back to her table. A few minutes later, another guest asked if I was visiting from out of town. When I said yes, he asked where, and I answered simply, Norfolk. He paused, then asked the question I had come to expect. So what do you do again? The again carried more weight than the words themselves. I gave a vague answer about logistics and administration, and he accepted it with a polite hum before moving on. That was the pattern. Curiosity followed by quick dismissal. It was not unkind. It was efficient. Around me, conversations turned to travel plans and investments and upcoming promotions. I listened without inserting myself, sipping my wine slowly and letting the noise wash over me. From across the room, Eliza laughed at something her fiancé said, the sound bright and unguarded. She looked happy in a way that drew attention effortlessly. I felt a familiar mix of affection and distance. I wanted good things for her. I also knew that her happiness had always required contrast. I was that contrast. At one point, my mother caught my eye and smiled with relief, clearly pleased that I was behaving as expected. I returned the smile because it cost me nothing. A server refilled my glass and asked if everything was all right. I thanked her and said it was lovely. It was, on the surface. As the evening progressed, the energy in the room shifted from anticipation to celebration. Toasts were prepared and chairs were rearranged. The guests leaned in closer to one another, voices lowering as the wine did its work. I stood briefly to stretch and felt eyes flick toward me before sliding away again. It struck me how little effort it took to remain unnoticed in a room full of people. I had spent years cultivating that skill. Someone asked if I was married, and when I said no, they offered a sympathetic smile and moved on. Another asked if I planned to stay in the area, and I said I would be leaving soon. The questions were small but cumulative, each one reinforcing the version of me that fit neatly into the background. My parents took their seats near the front, my mother smoothing her dress, and my father scanning the room with satisfaction. Eliza and her fiancé stood together, hands intertwined, ready to accept the attention that came naturally to them. I watched as he spoke with other officers, their posture mirroring one another in subtle ways that suggested shared understanding. He belonged easily in this environment. That did not surprise me. What surprised me was the flicker of recognition I thought I saw when his gaze briefly met mine from across the room. It passed quickly, replaced by the polite neutrality he offered everyone else. I dismissed it as coincidence. The music softened and the room quieted as someone tapped a glass to signal the start of speeches. My mother leaned toward the microphone, her voice warm and practiced. She thanked everyone for coming and spoke about family and milestones and how proud she was of Eliza. The words were familiar and safe. She spoke about dreams realized and the joy of seeing your children succeed. I listened with measured calm, aware of the omissions and understanding their purpose. When she gestured toward me briefly and mentioned how nice it was that everyone could be together, a ripple of polite applause followed. That was my contribution. As the applause faded and attention shifted back to Eliza and her fiancé, I felt the quiet tightening in my chest that came from being present but peripheral. I had expected this. I had prepared for it. Still, there was a moment when I wondered what it would feel like to be introduced without qualifiers, to have my presence acknowledged as something other than an obligation fulfilled. The thought did not linger. The night moved on. The wine continued to flow. Laughter rose and fell. From my place at the edge, I observed the careful choreography of a family determined to keep everything in its proper place. I did not yet know how quickly that balance would be disrupted, or how little it would take for the room to turn its attention in a direction no one had planned for. My mother stood and lifted her glass with a smile that had been practiced for weeks. The room settled into a quiet expectancy, and I felt every eye turn toward the front. She spoke about love commitment and how proud she was of Eliza for finding someone so accomplished, so steady, so impressive. Each word landed exactly where it was meant to. Then she gestured toward me as if remembering an obligation. And of course, Erin is here too, she said lightly. Eliza's older sister. She paused just long enough for the next sentence to sound spontaneous. Erin has always done her own thing, our little failure at finding direction. Laughter rippled across the tables, polite and relieved, the way people laugh when someone else has been named as the joke. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but my face remained still. I had learned long ago that reacting only prolonged moments like this. My mother smiled, satisfied that she had framed me correctly without appearing cruel. The word failure hung in the air longer than she intended. I heard it echo against years of similar comments delivered with the same gentle tone. I was already preparing to let it pass when something shifted. The SEAL captain who had been standing beside Eliza turned slowly toward me. His expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know how to look. His eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in focus. He took a step closer and said my name clearly, Aaron Whitaker. The sound of it carried differently spoken with recognition instead of dismissal. I met his gaze, and in that instant I knew he was not guessing. He knew. He tilted his head slightly as if listening for something only he could hear. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "You were on the East Corridor rotation during that storm off Hatteras, weren't you?" The room was silent now, the laughter gone, replaced by confusion. I answered simply, "Yes." He nodded once and continued. "You gave the call to hold position when everyone else wanted to push through." His voice was steady and calm, but I could hear the weight behind it. "I remember that voice," he said, "over the radio, clear when nothing else was." The captain stepped back, half a pace, straightened his shoulders, and raised his hand in a precise salute. It was not theatrical. It was not hesitant. It was automatic and exact, the kind that comes from training and respect. The sound of his palm cutting the air seemed louder than the music had ever been. Chairs shifted. Someone gasped. Before anyone could speak, another man stood from a nearby table, an older officer with silver at his temples. He looked at me, then at the captain, and followed suit, returning the salute with equal formality. The room froze. My mother's glass trembled in her hand, and her smile collapsed into something unrecognizable. My father stared at me as if seeing me for the first time and not understanding what he was looking at. Eliza's face drained of color, her expression caught between anger and confusion. I stood slowly, not because I wanted attention, but because remaining seated felt suddenly inappropriate. The captain lowered his hand but did not look away. "Ma'am," he said clearly. "Thank you." The word settled over the room like a verdict. No one laughed. No one spoke. The story my family had told about me cracked open under the weight of a single gesture. I felt the pull to explain, to soften, to make it easier for everyone else. I did none of those things. I simply nodded once, acknowledging the salute, and nothing more. The silence stretched, and in it I could hear the unspoken questions racing through the room. Who was I really? How had they been wrong? Why had no one noticed? My mother found her voice first, but it sounded thin. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh, "Aaron has always been modest." The words fell flat. The captain turned to her with a respectful nod, but did not engage. He looked back at me instead, as if the rest of the room no longer mattered. I felt something loosen inside my chest, not relief, not triumph, but clarity. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about the truth no longer being contained. If you were there, would you have defended her? The question formed silently as I looked around the room at faces caught between discomfort and revelation. I did not need their defense. The salute had already done what years of silence could not. It had placed the truth where it belonged, out in the open, beyond anyone's ability to dismiss it. And in that moment, I understood that whatever came next would not be quiet. The silence did not last long once the room remembered how to breathe. Conversations restarted in fragments, chairs scraped softly, and glasses were set down with care that felt suddenly performative. My parents leaned toward one another, speaking in low, urgent tones, while Eliza turned toward me with a look that burned hotter than embarrassment. She did not wait for privacy. "You ruined my night," she said, her voice tight and controlled, like she was trying not to let it crack. People were watching again, but this time I did not shrink. I looked at her and saw not cruelty, but panic. Her perfect evening had been interrupted by a truth she had not prepared for. "I am sorry you feel that way," I said quietly, because that was the only honest thing I could offer. It was not an apology, and she heard that immediately. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You could have stayed quiet," she said. "You always do." I did not respond. There was nothing to explain and nothing to take back. The damage was done not by me, but by the story that had been exposed. My mother approached, then, her smile brittle, her eyes sharp. "We will talk about this later," she said, as if asserting control might still work. "Tonight is not the time." I nodded once and reached for my coat. I was done with the room. As I moved toward the exit, I felt the weight of eyes on my back, curiosity, discomfort, and something else that felt like reassessment. The captain did not stop me, but our eyes met briefly, and he inclined his head in a gesture that acknowledged what had just happened without demanding anything further. That was enough. Outside, the rain had begun without announcement, a steady southern downpour that soaked the pavement and blurred the lights along the river. I stepped into it without hesitation, letting the coolness ground me. The noise of the ballroom faded behind the closed doors, replaced by the sound of water hitting stone and the distant hum of traffic. I walked until the air filled my lungs and the tension eased from my shoulders. My phone vibrated once, then again, then did not stop. Messages stacked quickly, each one more formal than the last. "Norfolk HQ, please acknowledge. Follow-up required. Availability requested." I stopped beneath the overhang of a closed shop and scrolled through them, reading without responding. The operational review had escalated faster than I expected. Timing like this is rarely accidental. I considered the possibility that the salute had accelerated something already in motion. Visibility has a way of doing that. When you are quiet, you are easy to overlook. When you are seen, you become a factor. I typed a brief acknowledgement confirming receipt and stating I would respond when appropriate. The reply came almost immediately with a time and a request for immediate contact. I did not call back. Not yet. I needed a moment to separate what had just happened from what was coming next. Rainwater dripped from my hair onto my collar, and I welcomed the physical sensation. It reminded me where I was. Alive, present, and no longer invisible. A message from Eliza followed, sharp and accusing. "I cannot believe you did that. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was for me?" I read it once and locked the phone. I was not going to argue in text messages on a sidewalk in the rain. Some conversations require distance, to be honest. As I walked back toward the hotel, my mind moved methodically through possibilities. The review could remain procedural, or it could become something else depending on who had initiated it and why. I had prepared for scrutiny before. What unsettled me was the intersection of worlds I had kept separate by design. My family had always preferred the simplified version of me because it was easier to manage. The system prefers the same. Complexity threatens narratives, and narratives protect power. Back in my room, I hung my coat and stood by the window, watching the rain streak the glass. Savannah glowed below, softened by water and light and the illusion of calm. My phone buzzed again. This time the message was different. A brief note from a number I recognized. "I was there during that operation. You did the right thing. Hold steady." The sender did not sign their name and did not need to. I exhaled slowly. That message mattered more than all the others combined. It told me that the truth had witnesses even if they had not spoken yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and allowed myself a moment to feel the weight of the night. The confrontation with Eliza, the look on my mother's face, the salute that had changed everything, none of it could be undone. I did not want it to be. When my phone rang again, I answered this time. "Yes," I said calmly. I received the messages. There was a pause on the other end, then a measured response. "We will need you in Norfolk first thing Monday." "Understood," I replied. The line went dead. I set the phone down and looked around the room at the neutral walls and impersonal furniture. This was the cost of being seen. Once the truth surfaced, it demanded follow-through. Outside, the rain began to slow, leaving the streets shining and reflective. I felt the familiar pull of responsibility settle into place, not as fear, but as focus. Whatever was coming, I would meet it the same way I always had prepared, informed and without apology. The suspension notice arrived before sunrise the next morning, and it was written in the same neutral language that makes difficult things sound procedural rather than personal. Effective immediately pending further review, administrative suspension with restricted access. No accusation, no explanation, just a change in status that altered everything beneath it. I read it standing in the quiet of my hotel room, the curtains still drawn, the city not yet awake. Suspensions are meant to feel temporary, but they carry a weight that lingers because they place you outside the rhythm you have trained your life around. I acknowledged receipt and packed the rest of my bag with care, leaving Savannah before anyone else in my family stirred. The drive north was steady and gray and gave me time to think without interruption. By the time I reached Norfolk, the rain had cleared, but the air felt heavy as if the storm had simply shifted locations. I reported as instructed and was escorted to a small office away from my usual workspaces. My access badge no longer opened familiar doors. That change was subtle but unmistakable. People who passed me in the hallway offered brief nods or avoided eye contact altogether. Rumors travel faster than facts, and I could feel the narrative taking shape without my input. Inside the office, a senior administrator reviewed the notice with practiced calm, emphasizing that the suspension was not punitive, only precautionary. Those words are meant to reassure, but they rarely do. Precaution implies risk, and risk invites speculation. When I asked who had requested the review, the answer came carefully framed. The request was elevated through proper channels, she said. Elevated how I asked. She hesitated just long enough for the omission to register. The name came later in a separate conversation spoken quietly, as if volume could soften its impact. The review had been prompted by an inquiry linked to a senior figure whose influence extended beyond the base. The surname was familiar enough to make the room feel smaller. It belonged to someone whose career intersected with mine years earlier at a distance, but whose authority now carried weight I could not ignore. The connection did not prove wrongdoing, but it explained the urgency. High-level interest changes how questions are asked and how answers are received. As the day unfolded, I began to see how the facts were being rearranged, not overtly altered, but selectively emphasized. Decisions made under specific conditions were now discussed as isolated moments stripped of context. Language shifted subtly from why to whether. A recorded directive became a suggestion. A confirmed condition became an assumption. None of it was dramatic enough to challenge outright, and that was the point. The truth was not erased, it was diluted. I requested copies of the relevant files and was told they were under review. I asked to submit my own documentation and was instructed to wait. Waiting is another form of control, and one the system uses well. In the absence of clarity, stories fill the gaps. I heard whispers of recklessness and questioned judgment spoken just loudly enough to reach me. No one confronted me directly because confrontation invites rebuttal. Indirection allows distortion to settle. I understood then that this was not about uncovering facts, it was about managing optics. Someone with influence had decided that my version of events complicated a larger narrative, and complexity was being discouraged. I returned to my apartment that evening and sat at the same table where I had read the initial email days earlier. The binders on the shelves felt heavier now, not because they held secrets, but because they held truth that was being treated as negotiable. I began organizing my own record-assembling timelines, logs, and communications with the precision the work had taught me. If the system wanted to question my actions, it would have to do so in the presence of complete information. That was my leverage, and I knew how to use it. Still, I could not ignore the reality that authority shapes outcomes as much as evidence does. When senior names enter a review, neutrality becomes conditional. I thought about how easily my family had labeled me without consequence, and how the system now mirrored that behavior on a larger scale. Both preferred a simpler story. Both resisted disruption. Late that night, my phone rang, and I recognized the number before answering. It belonged to someone who had been in the room years ago when the decision now under scrutiny had been made. I did not save the contact, but I remembered the voice. "Be careful," she said without greeting. "They are narrowing the frame." I thanked her and hung up. The warning confirmed what I already sensed. The truth was still intact, but it was being handled. I slept little that night, and when morning came, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. For me, everything had. The suspension had placed me in a familiar position, isolated, scrutinized, and expected to accept whatever outcome emerged quietly. I had done that before, and it had cost me more than anyone realized. This time, I would not allow the story to be rewritten without resistance. The system had pushed back, and now it was my turn to decide how much pressure I was willing to apply in return. The hearing room was colder than necessary, the kind of cold meant to keep people alert and slightly off balance. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in flat clarity with no shadows to hide behind. I took my seat at the narrow table and placed my folder in front of me, aligning it carefully with the edge, as if order itself might steady the air. Across from me sat a row of officials, their expressions neutral, practiced unreadable. This was not a courtroom, and there would be no speeches. Hearings like this are designed to feel administrative even when they decide the trajectory of a life. A recorder clicked on and the chair cleared his throat. "We are here to review actions taken during a prior operation," he said, reading from a prepared statement. The language was precise, stripped of emotion, and intentionally vague. I listened without interruption because listening gives you information, and information is leverage. When it was my turn to speak, I stated my name and role, and then stopped. Silence followed, not uncomfortable but expectant. They wanted explanation, justification, narrative. I did not offer it. Instead, I slid the folder forward and opened it to the first page. Logs, timestamps, recordings, I said evenly. Everything is there. A pause stretched as one of them reached for the documents. Papers shuffled, screens flickered, and the room settled into the quiet rhythm of review. I watched their eyes move across data points, their pens marking notes in the margins. This was the part I trusted. Data does not argue. It does not exaggerate or defend itself. It simply exists and waits to be interpreted. The first recording played my voice steady over background noise, requesting a course adjustment with time and coordinates clearly marked. The second followed moments later, confirming conditions that matched the request. A third recording captured the acknowledgement from higher command, granting clearance. The timestamps aligned seamlessly, creating a chain that required no commentary. Someone asked about decision-making under pressure, and I answered briefly, citing protocol and training. Someone else suggested alternative interpretations, and I pointed them back to the data. The room remained quiet, except for the hum of equipment and the occasional scratch of a pen. This was not dramatic, and it was not meant to be. Justice rarely announces itself. It unfolds in increments when someone insists on accuracy. As the review continued, I could sense the shift, subtle but unmistakable. The narrative that had begun to form outside this room struggled to survive inside it. Facts resist distortion when presented without embellishment. At one point, the chair looked up and asked why I had not brought this forward sooner. I met his gaze and answered honestly, I was not asked. The simplicity of the statement settled heavily. Silence again, not empty this time, but thoughtful. The hearing stretched on, measured, deliberate, and thorough. When it ended, there was no immediate verdict, only a promise of review and deliberation. I gathered my folder, stood, and thanked them for their time, because courtesy costs nothing. As I left the room, I did not feel relief or vindication. I felt steady. Whatever decision came next would have to contend with the record now fully exposed. Outside the building, the sky was overcast and the air smelled faintly of rain. I walked to my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, letting the quiet settle. Do you trust emotions or evidence? The question surfaced as I thought about the conversations that had swirled around me in the days leading up to this moment. Emotions had fueled assumptions and resentment. Evidence had spoken calmly and without agenda. I knew which one I had built my life around. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Heard the recordings. You were right. No signature, no follow-up. I put the phone away and drove home, aware that outcomes take time and that truth does not rush to be believed. It waits. The decision arrived 3 days later in a secure message that contained fewer words than the notice of suspension had. Findings reviewed, actions consistent with established protocol, no procedural violations identified. Administrative suspension lifted effective immediately. I read it once, then again, not because I doubted it, but because the simplicity felt unreal after the noise that had surrounded it. There was no acknowledgement of stress endured, no recognition of impact, only a conclusion delivered without flourish. Justice does not always arrive with ceremony. Often it comes quietly and leaves you alone to process what it has changed. I returned to the base the next morning and walked through the same corridors with a badge that once again opened doors. People greeted me politely, some with relief, some with awkward restraint. No one clapped, no one spoke my name with admiration. That was fine. Applause has never been a reliable measure of truth. In a closed session later that day, I was informed that the inquiry had expanded. The individual whose interpretation of events had raised questions about my judgment was now under review himself. The language remained careful, but the meaning was clear. When narratives fail scrutiny, they reverse direction. Accountability does not always land where it was first aimed. I asked no questions and offered no commentary. I had learned long ago that vindication loses power when you linger in it. What mattered was that the record now reflected reality. The system corrected itself not because it wanted to, but because it could no longer sustain the distortion. Still, there were absences that lingered. No senior officer reached out to acknowledge the outcome. No apology was offered for the suspension or the speculation that had preceded it. Silence filled that space, and I recognized it for what it was. Institutions rarely apologize because apology implies fault, and fault threatens authority. Instead, they move on and expect you to do the same. I returned to my duties without fanfare, picking up where I had left off as if nothing had happened. In meetings, my input was once again sought and considered. The rhythm returned, but something in me had shifted. I was no longer under the illusion that doing everything right guaranteed protection. I had seen how quickly competence could be questioned when it conflicted with convenience. That knowledge did not make me bitter. It made me precise. Precision is how you survive systems that prefer simplicity over nuance. Outside of work, my phone remained quiet. No messages from my parents, no acknowledgement of the night in Savannah or the aftermath that had followed. Eliza did not reach out. I did not expect her to. Her world had tilted, and people rarely thank the force that causes the shift, even when it reveals the truth. Days passed, then a week, and the distance between that night and my present began to feel measured rather than raw. I stood on the pier one evening watching the tide move in and out, steady and indifferent. The ocean does not celebrate corrections. It simply continues. I thought about the officer now under investigation and felt no satisfaction. Accountability is not revenge. It is alignment. When actions and consequences finally meet, something settles even if no one marks the moment. Justice without applause requires a certain acceptance. You must be willing to let the truth stand on its own without demanding acknowledgement. That has always been the hardest part for people who have been misrepresented. They want the world to correct itself loudly. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes the correction is quiet, and the only evidence is the absence of further distortion. As I turned away from the water, I understood that this was the outcome I had always been prepared for. Not recognition, not reconciliation, just the restoration of integrity. The system had tested me, and in doing so had revealed its limits. I would carry that knowledge forward the way I carried everything else, without display, without complaint, and without forgetting how easily silence can be mistaken for consent. The call came on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the light slanted low across my living room and the world felt briefly suspended. I recognized my mother's number immediately and let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation but habit. Her voice sounded softer than usual, careful, as if testing the ground before stepping forward. "Erin," she said, "how are you?" It was the first time she had asked that question without an agenda trailing behind it. I told her I was fine and waited. Silence filled the line long enough for me to imagine her glancing at my father, deciding who should speak next. "We heard things worked out," she said finally. "Your situation." I thanked her for calling and said nothing else. She cleared her throat and continued. "It was all very confusing. No one really understood what happened. The familiar reframing had begun. Confusion instead of accountability, misunderstanding instead of omission. I listened without interrupting because I had learned that people reveal more when you let them talk. Then she said, "Your sister has been having a hard time." The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Eliza had always been the reason conversations shifted. My mother explained that some of Eliza's friends had distanced themselves after the engagement. Invitations had slowed, conversations had cooled, and a few opportunities she had expected to follow the engagement announcement no longer seemed certain. "People talk," my mother said quietly, as if gossip were an unavoidable force rather than a consequence. She paused, then asked the question she had been circling. "Maybe you could help smooth things over." I closed my eyes briefly and breathed in. There it was. The request to make myself smaller so someone else could regain comfort. I told her gently that I could not do that. She sounded surprised, not offended, just genuinely unprepared for refusal. "You don't even know what she wants," she said. "I do," I replied. "She wants the story to go back to how it was." My mother did not argue. She sighed and said, "Your father thinks it would be best for everyone if we moved past this. Best for everyone has always meant best for Eliza." I asked her if anyone had asked me what would be best for me. The silence on the other end was answer enough. A few minutes later, Eliza called herself, her voice tight with frustration disguised as civility. She did not waste time on pleasantries. "You embarrassed me," she said. "You made me look foolish in front of people who matter." I told her calmly that I had not said anything that night. She disagreed, insisting that my presence had changed everything. "You could have told him not to do that," she said, referring to the salute as if it were a performance I had orchestrated. I told her that respect cannot be scheduled or redirected once it is earned. She accused me of enjoying the attention. I reminded her that attention had never been my goal. She asked again if I would help fix things. I asked her what fixing meant. She said speaking to people, clarifying that things were exaggerated, reminding them that I was still just Aaron. The implication was clear. "Reduce yourself so I can recover." I told her no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just no. The word felt heavier than it should have, but also right. She grew quiet, then said, "You always do this. You always act like you're above us." I replied evenly that distance is not superiority, and that boundaries are not punishment. She hung up without saying goodbye. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly. Eliza's social circle shifted, invitations she had counted on did not materialize, and connections she had assumed were permanent proved conditional. The narrative she had relied on had cracked, and without it, her position was less secure. My parents stopped calling as frequently. When they did, the conversations were polite and surface level. No one apologized and no one demanded forgiveness. The distance settled into something that felt final rather than temporary. I did not celebrate her losses or feel satisfaction in them. I simply accepted them as the natural result of truth entering a space built on appearances. Would you forgive or finally draw the line? The question stayed with me as I considered the shape of my family without my silence holding it together. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had not been offered. What I had done instead was choose clarity over comfort. It was not loud or dramatic. It did not restore harmony. It did something better. It ended the expectation that I would continue to erase myself for the sake of someone else's standing. Returning to Norfolk felt less like coming back and more like settling into alignment. There was no announcement, no change in routine, no sense that anything extraordinary had occurred. I unpacked my bag, placed my boots by the door, and returned to the cadence that had shaped my life long before Savannah. Work resumed with the same quiet intensity and expectations that had always governed it. No one asked how I felt about what had happened, and I did not offer commentary. Vindication has a way of exhausting people who chase it, and I had learned that satisfaction fades quickly when it relies on external acknowledgement. What remained instead was space. Space created by distance and by the decision to stop explaining myself. Evenings found me near the water where the city softened and the horizon stretched wide. The ocean does not ask questions or demand context. It exists, and in doing so invites you to do the same. I walked along the pier, often listening to the wind move across the surface of the water and watching ships pass without ceremony. There were no congratulations waiting for me, no gathering of colleagues or family eager to reframe the narrative. That absence was not painful. It was clarifying. For the first time, I did not feel pulled between versions of myself or obligated to maintain balance in spaces that required my erasure. Distance became a form of care, not punishment, but preservation. Calls from my parents slowed to brief updates and polite exchanges. We spoke about weather and logistics and nothing that mattered. I let the conversations end naturally without pushing them toward resolution. Vindication would have required confrontation, and I was no longer interested in reopening wounds for the sake of being understood. Understanding cannot be forced, and peace does not come from winning arguments that should never have been necessary. Eliza did not call again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that her world had adjusted and that she was learning how conditional admiration can be. I did not reach out. Growth is a solitary process, and interference only delays it. In Norfolk, my days were measured by responsibility rather than reaction. The work required focus and restraint and rewarded consistency. It did not care who applauded or who doubted. That impartiality felt like relief. I found myself breathing more easily, sleeping more deeply, and noticing details I had once rushed past. Morning light on the water, the sound of gulls overhead, the steady rhythm of tides that had nothing to prove. I understood then that distance had given me something vindication never could. It had given me ownership of my own narrative without the need to defend it. There were moments when I thought about the engagement night and the way the room had frozen around a single gesture. That memory no longer carried heat. It was simply a turning point, a line drawn not in anger but in clarity. The truth had surfaced and done its work. It did not need to be revisited. Standing by the water one evening, I realized that my life had never been small. It had simply been contained by other people's expectations. By stepping away, I had not abandoned my family so much as refused to carry a version of myself that no longer fit. The sea moved steadily beside me, indifferent to personal histories and unresolved conversations. That indifference felt like permission. I did not need to be seen or validated to exist fully. Distance had not diminished me. It had returned me to myself. Peace arrived without announcement the way dawn does when you are not watching the clock. I stood on the pier before sunrise, wrapped in a light jacket, the wood beneath my boots cool and damp from the night air. Norfolk was quiet at that hour, not empty, but resting between movements. The horizon held a thin line of pale gold, where the sky began to separate itself from the water, and the ocean lay calm as if nothing had ever disturbed it. I breathed in slowly, letting the salt fill my lungs, and felt something settle that had been restless for years. I was not waiting for anything to happen. I was simply there. For most of my life, stillness had meant uncertainty, a pause before judgment or reaction. Now, it felt like arrival. The events of the past weeks did not replay in my mind with urgency or regret. They existed as facts, not wounds. I thought about the night in Savannah and the way everything had shifted in a matter of seconds, not because I spoke, but because someone else recognized me. That recognition had not created my worth. It had only revealed it to people who had chosen not to see. I understood now that proving yourself to those who benefit from your silence is a losing pursuit. You cannot convince someone to respect you if their comfort depends on your diminishment. The wind moved across the water, gentle and steady, and I watched the surface ripple without resistance. This was what peace looked like, not triumph, not applause, not reconciliation, just the absence of pressure to perform. I had spent years calibrating my presence, measuring my words, anticipating how much of myself was acceptable in any given room. That vigilance had kept things orderly, but it had also kept me small. Standing there as the sky brightened, I realized how much energy had gone into that containment. Letting it go felt less like a decision and more like permission granted at last. The work I did would continue demanding precision and restraint, but it would no longer require invisibility. I did not need to announce that shift or justify it. It would be evident in how I moved through the world from this point forward. I would speak when accuracy mattered and remain silent when silence served me, not when it protected someone else. The sun broke free of the horizon, then casting light across the water in a way that felt deliberate and earned. I did not feel victorious because victory implies an opponent, and I was not interested in defining my life by opposition anymore. My parents might never understand the cost of their language or the weight of their omissions. Eliza might never see beyond the version of me that made her feel secure. That was no longer my burden. Forgiveness had not been requested, and I had stopped offering it as a substitute for accountability. Instead, I chose distance not as punishment, but as clarity. Distance allowed me to live without shrinking, without editing my presence to fit someone else's narrative. I thought about how often women are taught that peace is something you negotiate, that you compromise your way into it by yielding just enough to keep others comfortable. What I had learned instead was that peace is claimed. It does not require consensus. It requires honesty with yourself and the courage to accept what that honesty costs. I had not won anything tangible, no accolades, no repaired relationships, no public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Yet I felt fuller than I ever had. The absence of constant self-adjustment created space for something quieter and more enduring. Self-respect does not announce itself. It shows up in choices made consistently even when no one is watching. As the pier warmed beneath my feet and the morning deepened, I understood that the most important shift had not occurred in a ballroom or a hearing room. It had happened the moment I stopped believing that my value depended on being seen by people who refused to look. From now on, my life would be measured by alignment, not approval. I would take up the space my work and integrity required and leave the rest behind without apology. Peace was not loud. It did not need to be. It lived in this moment, in the steady light, in the sound of water against wood, in the knowledge that I no longer needed to make myself smaller to belong.